Today we're going to be hopping in the Wayback Machine and looking at the defining decks from each meta of FFG Star Wars Destiny. A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando. Hey there, Star Wars Destiny folks, and happy Destiny Friday. Thanks for checking in. I know we didn't have Destiny Friday last Friday. That's because I had the big spoiler reveal for Flesh and Blood, and I don't want to distract because things get buried and all that. So thanks for bearing with me. Do want to make sure you've checked out the new series that Swagdean is kicking off for us here on the channel, kind of taking a look back at Star Wars Destiny, not just FFG Destiny, but Star Wars Destiny as a whole, and looking at the history and the evolution of the game. I think it's actually a really cool series, which is why we're putting it up, but it's always good to hear from him as well. So make sure you go check that out. Now, today is also a Wayback Machine, of course, but kind of inspired differently. So there was actually a comment last weekend at this point by Nicholas Vincent Pontillo, and he said, so I have a ton of cards and I want to finally make use of them. I'd like to build the best decks from each meta throughout the years. Does anyone have a database on that or a link to deck lists from those times? Now, while I'm not going to be going through 400 deck lists today, what I am going to be going through are the top pairings from each meta. You can see we're going to do this, what we call PTI style over here. We've got the checklist on the side. So I want to go through the deck list for each meta, and then of course you can go to the old, I do recommend going to the old database, which is swdb.com. It is still up. I checked it just minutes before I shot this. It's still up. And then you can go put in the team comps, right? You can use the search function, put in the team comps, and you can go find deck lists. Folks back then were not too secret about being like, I won the best 5-0 bear. And then, right, let's look it up and find the one that's 5-0 with the most hearts. Click on that, and that'll be a decent list for you. Okay. Now, what's interesting about his question is that, well, there was no best deck for each. Well, there was, but there was a best deck for each meta, but there was multiple metas per set, right? And the reason that is a thing is because FFG was, that's the reason the game died. And by that, I mean on their side, right? It's the reason their product died. Let me say that. It's the reason their product died is because they were incapable of hitting release dates. And in order to kind of float that in between expansions, if there was a long time between expansions, what they would do is they would actually do a change, right? They could shake it up by doing points adjustments. They could errata some cards or put things on a restrictions list or whatever they ended up doing. We ended up in some cases, not all, but in some cases, we ended up with multiple metas, right? Because maybe it was something like there was a top deck and they went and killed it, so then everything readjusted. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it was something like what happened in Way of the Force was it was just so long until the next set that they kind of had to make changes. We saw something very similar in Spark of Hope going into Convergent or Covert Missions, Saw something very similar. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and start at the very beginning, very beginning, which was Awakenings. So out of that set, out of the first set, one of the first ones that came to light as being the big bad problem deck was Jango Veers. And that's primarily because Jango Fett was able to action cheat, for the lack of a better term, and was able to, so when they roll in, he could respond and roll in and pew pew, right? That's how he worked. And that was just kind of a good guns deck. And, you had, again, the number of guns were limited. You had Hold Up Blaster and you had F11D. So the F11D being only villain gave a distinct advantage to villain decks at the time, as long as you were running red, that there was just more redeploy guns for you to have, right? Because you were working with a very, very limited card pool. And that was basically the problem. Or the problem statement at the time for heroes was that from a gun side, they just had more. Villains just had more. Okay. We also had a big deck, Vader Raider. This is what ended up winning the very first Worlds. I would have to say that that's, in terms of his question of what was the top deck from each meta, it's probably between this one and Phasma Bala Trooper. Phasma Bala Trooper was something that came out of, I don't remember, it was Sugi's cast. I don't remember what they called them, but that was the very first place I heard of that cast, and it was Phasma Balatik and First Order Stormtrooper. What this did is it there was another version of it running around that, and I want to point out with Night Sister, you couldn't run, you couldn't do necessarily both at 4 die, right? But there were versions where people were incorporating in Night Sister and doing pings and stuff. I realized the one that's down there, I'm pointing over there, is not necessarily, right? That's not necessarily your team comp. What you wanted to run was, in this case, Elite Phasma, Bala, single die, and then First Order Stormtrooper. And then what you would do is you would pile all of your stuff, again, to those redeploys, you pile them on Bala, try to take out one of their characters. You'd get a reset, get extra die out of it. It was pretty good, pretty decent. And then on the hero side, primarily, there were other hero decks, but if we're talking top of the meta, Han and Rey was a big one, also because of the action sheet thing, right? So with Rey, after you play an upgrade on her, you can take an additional action. Well, if that has ambush, right, like Holdout Blaster being the primary one, then you could play that on her, and then you'd get 2 actions. Most cases, folks are rolling out Han in that case, right? If you did it early, you could disrupt them, potentially take it away, or smack somebody. So that was a very popular one for Awakening. So that pretty much rounds out the Awakenings meta. Again, there were other decks, but these were primarily the ones that were leading the charge. Right, we then moved to Spirit of Rebellion. Okay, so Spirit of Rebellion came out, and this was kind of an awkward set in the way that it came out, that when it dropped, we were very, very, very hungry for cards. We were going into the first Store Championship season, kind of on the horizon. And what came out and led the charge was FN Unkar, okay, along with First Order Stormtrooper. And FN, of course, when he came, so he ended up getting an errata. Unkar Flood ended up getting, I believe it was a Balance of the Force. And this deck was just constant make money, roll in, do things, right? I mean, it was just a lot of dice coming in over and over and over again. FN very quickly earned himself a nerf on that. And this deck kind of went away over time, but it was definitely what I think would have been considered out of the gate the top tier, right? The tier 0 deck. But the deck that ended up dominating the vast majority of that meta was actually, in terms of Spirit of Rebellion itself, was actually Pomaz. So Pomaz, again, letting you do some pretty stupid, silly things in terms of action cheating, taking multiple actions and then rolling in and resolving so they didn't have a chance to remove. And again, this was very early in the game, and there was limited stuff that could do that, and this deck could do it insanely consistently, throwing big old dice at you with Pose Special. It was pretty ugly. Now, we also have the deck that I was playing pretty religiously at the time was Luke Rey. So you say, look at that, and you're like, well, both of those are Awakenings characters. Why was that big in SOR? Well, the answer there very specifically were 2 things. One, it was Vibro Knife, came out in Spirit of Rebellion, which basically was just what we were talking before with the Han Rey thing, which also was in this meta, by the way, and also got better because of Vibro Knife. It basically is the melee version. At the time, it was the melee version of Holdout Blaster. So it enabled those cheats, right? Those action cheats to that point. The other reason it was so big was because My Ally is the Force came out in Spirit of Rebellion, which essentially let you do a dual result for it. It was a 2-drop, but if you could get a big die out, you could get a double resolution off of it for 2, and then that's pretty good, right? You smack them, don't remove your die, and then you smack them again, right? Again, in a limited format, resources were a lot harder to come by back then. And then we did have Big Palpatine released in that set. He was no joke. A lot of people, I mean, those are bigs. Again, you have to go back in the way, you look at that now and you're like, wow, that character's awful. And even by later in Destiny, he was awful. But at the time, he was not. Okay, and being able to come in and deal 2 effective indirect, it wasn't indirect yet, that wasn't a thing, but that's effectively what he was dealing whenever he could just resolve his die. And people figured out that if you actually played him slower, it was better, right? You would just kind of roll in. It's like, oh, I'll take 2 shields all day long, right? And just kind of whittle them down. Meanwhile, you're getting big things on. Maybe he can rise again, heal 5 points, get an upgrade. And then he becomes a big beat stick. So that was the thing there. And then, as I already mentioned, Han Rey got better because it picked up Vibro Knife, as well as other couple things, as well as a couple other things. Okay. Not to mention in the next set, he got Fast Hands, which quickly got nerfed. All right, we then went into a weird little meta where the 2-player set dropped, I want to say about like a month and change before Empire at War dropped. So it was like a mid to late summer drop of the 2-player set. and then Empire at War dropped in the fall, like September-ish timeframe. So we had this like weird 6-week meta where we had the 2-player set and Spirit of Rebellion and no EAW yet, but we knew EAW was on the horizon. We were seeing spoilers from it. So it was this really weird set where like this really weird age where everybody knew it was temporary to a certain extent. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting to include the flavor there. But what came out of this was we got 4 new heroes. We got Rey Poe, which in of itself was actually a pretty strong deck. Actually did dominate that meta, using some of the stuff like, what was it, Chirrut's Lightning or Chirrut's Staff. But we also got Phasma and Kylo, and both of those characters, all 4 of those characters, worked their way into the meta pretty quickly, and some of them even stayed far beyond. So what we ended up with first was Phasma Darth Vader, and this was a very, very strong deck. You had special stuff there, and you could just do a lot of damage. We had, because remember, Phasma does more damage when they have damage. Vader was hurting himself, so you had that. We then had Kylo FN, which at this point it was FN had taken his nerf at that point, but you could still play a 1-die FN because you could get the roll-in, and he had taken the nerf on the roll-in as well. Okay, but you had that going on. Rey Poe, as I already mentioned, was very strong. Kylo Grievous was actually a thing that was what my wife was playing for a while. She took down her first local, what was it, took down her first weekly tournament, kit tournament on that. And then we also had, that's a mistake down there. I have Kylo and Kylo down there, but what popped out of that was actually a deck called Emo Kids, which was Darth Vader and Kylo Ren. So again, on the bottom there, that is a mistake. It's actually supposed to be Darth Vader, not Kylo. It's Darth Vader and Little Kylo for a deck that was called Emo Kids. All right, we then move on to what came out in Empire at War. Sabine and Ezra was a big one that came out of that. Probably the deck that was dominating the most out of it was Cad Bane, and Phasma was pretty strong. Now, eventually Phasma did get her buff to 14 points, or her balance of force up to 14 points. Took that deck away. But that deck was very, very, very strong with Cad's, again, effective action cheating. Okay. I then have, again, copy paste mistake, not Kylo. That is Emo Kids. I'll fix both of those in overlay, so you won't even know what the heck I'm talking about, but I'll fix those. We then had an interesting deck come out, which was Rey Padawans, and this was basically just not really abusing, but utilizing the Padawans for weapons. So you had 3 wide. At that point, that's still a lot of health back then. You got 2 weapons at -1, so you could be potentially dropping 2 weapons on turn 1. Many of which had either, because at that point we had Rey's lightsaber, so you had Rey's lightsaber, you had Shoto, you had Ancient lightsaber, all of which came out in the set. You had a plethora of blue weapons, and it was very, very, very strong to be able to get that many dice out that quick at a discount. We also had Seventh Sister Reset, which was an interesting deck. Mike was playing the snot out of this at the time, and the idea here was that you would put a whole bunch of stuff on the Night Sister. You had Rainbow to do a bunch of like reactivation things. You could feint and roll her in and get her dice, and then get because what would happen is when you would have her little minions, right, the Seeker droids, they would roll in, and then you would get the extra from her if you were to roll her in again. And all of a sudden you could have like way more Seeker droid dice than you actually had because of the roll-ins, trying to do the resets on her. And then at that point, Rey Poe was actually still a thing as well. Moving in then to Legacies. Legacies really changed. You see a lot of the decks kind of that we've been looking at so far were relatively consistent, or they would carry over. But Legacies really changed everything because it came out, there was a definite power creep step, which is not a bad thing in terms of the characters, but we also saw the advent of indirect damage, and we saw Mill kind of pop up. And to that point, one of the decks early was Zeb Yoda. Yoda was very, very, very strong. You're going to see him continue to carry throughout the rest of this discussion. We had Cad Sienna, which was Cad Sienna plus a 2-point plot. That was basically the backfill for Cad Phasma. It definitely dropped from a tier 0 to like, let's say a tier 1.5 type deck. Rey Ayla Profitable Connections was also a very strong deck, kind of employing on the early big drop redeploy weapons, right? At that point, remember, you had mini, or you had a couple of 3 cost redeploy lightsabers, And with Profitable Connections giving the extra $1, you could do that. And then you had 2 strong heroes, one of which could get shields, right? With Shotos, and you could do that. You could get shield, remove a shield to ping. It was a very consistent deck, and once it got going, it was hard to kill. Callous Talzin was also kind of another like tier 1.5 deck out of that, because you had a lot of your own dice control. One of the issues on this one was that, again, with Talzin, you're wanting to run mostly 1s or 3s. So you could run a couple cards like Hidden Motive and stuff like that, but other than that, you were limited to 1s. Sabine and Ezra continued to be a thing. And then one of the big, I would say this is probably the biggest one of the meta, was 5-die villain. Now, I want to be clear, it was not necessarily winning everything outright. This was actually a pretty well-balanced meta overall. But 5-die villain, just look at the amount of health. You had potential reset, right? There was a Bala version of this as well if you didn't want to play Guavian. But I think this deck here is what most people ended up doing. And it was just, again, you had several villain redeploys to get down. It's just a lot of dice. You lose a character, they move over, you roll that character in, you get reuse out of those dice on the same turn. You had Greedo to do his thing. And very impressive deck at the time. Right, moving into Way of the Force 1. So as I mentioned in the intro, this was one of the sets that it took a long time to see the next one. So we effectively had 2, if not 3, metas out of this one. And to be clear, some of the ones we had already seen to this point had multiple metas as well. They had changing metas when things got nerfed. But there were 2 very, very different metas coming out of this one. The first mill deck that was very super strong was one I won a store championship on myself, was Cassian Yoda, and Cassian Yoda Profitable. And this was also Tarkin Snoke Age. This was the rise of the Tarkin Snoke Age. Very strong deck there. It didn't end up getting, ended up getting more tools in the next set where it became even stronger. This was definitely the rise of the Tarkin Snoke Age. And it was definitely the rise of the Snoke Age. There's a reason he's on the thumbnail. Is Snoke is probably, over the course of FFG Destiny, probably the character that caused them, I think, the most problems overall. We also had Kylo, that's 2-player set, Kylo and Arenda Price. Very strong deck there as well with a red-blue. They fit well together. They had special synergy in terms of her special being able to flip things. We also saw Sprinkler Luke, and he worked well with a couple of characters, but the one I chose here to kind of represent that was Rey. We had DJ Phasma, so kind of a control-y do damage deck, right? DJ on removal does ping. He's got decent die himself. DJ Phasma was definitely a thing as well. We also had Leia. This was the very beginning of Leia Yoda, which became probably the signature hero mill deck of the FFG era. But it was not the leading deck until like Convergence. Okay, but we did see this one come. There was a lot of debate over whether Leia Yoda was better or Cassian Yoda was. I preferred Cassian Yoda, but you could have gone either way. But again, if you're going to focus on Leia Yoda being a strong mill deck, which I think is completely fair, I think you really want to put it in context of actually later on, once Convergence came out. All right, so now Way of the Force 2, what happened is we went into Gen Con, and they had the big tournaments at Gen Con, and what came out of that was what was dubbed Millpocalypse at the time, and that's what you see first there on the upper left, Cassian, Yoda, and Anakin Skywalker. So this was single die Cassian, single die Anakin, double die Yoda, and you can see that's what it's there to do, is mill Anakin with his pod racer. It was pretty disgusting with the fact that he was able to do what he did. You could mill and get shields, and there was just a ton of health to blow through. There was really no good first target either, because with your easy pickings and your good removal, you wanted the yellow characters to be gone, but there were 2 yellow targets to keep those spots on. You had Yoda, who could keep doing things, mill and protect at the same time, or make the money that you needed. Very, very, very strong deck. Tarkin Snoke would have been better in the Dage if it hadn't been for the fact that the wide decks were very popular and the fact that a lot of their damage came from indirect. They just had a problem competing with some of these wide decks, which is, I think that's how a meta works, right? Leia Yoda, again, was continuing to grow, but it was absolutely not as good of a mill deck as the Millpocalypse deck, which was the Yoda, Anakin, Cassian deck. The Rey deck that we looked before was actually replaced by Plo Koon, because Plo, when he worked with the Padawans, picked up their ability twice. So because he picked one up from each, so when you were to drop a 2-drop on Plo, or the first weapon you play on Plo would be -2, right? Because it would stack with each Padawan ability. So you ended up having a very cool deck here that could just drop upgrades like crazy. This was also the rise of Afra Snoke Battle Droid, or several other variants of Afra decks. Again, you can't throw all of the, I can't make a billion things on here, but Afra was finally starting to get her rise. She was a very interesting character, played very early with Tarkin, but never really went anywhere. But as she started getting more and more and more tools, we started to see her grow in a lot of different ways. She was almost always played in like a rainbow wide, so she could get access to all of the cards that she needed for all the various droids she wanted to do. But again, she's another one of those heroes that really peaked after Convergence. And then we also had, in the later years, or in the later time of this, we had Obi-Maz pop up, because you could just roll in and hit. That was basically the idea there, right? All right, and keep in mind, right, because you could resolve 2 of your dice, right, you can focus. That's exactly the same thing she was doing with the Poe thing, is you could roll in, focus, smack. Okay, but this, to be clear, that deck was not, it was like a tier 1.5 deck. It was nowhere near on the level that Poe-Maz was. All right, now on this one, as we move into Across the Galaxy, came out to much fanfare because it was a vehicle-focused expansion. And no piloting yet, by the way, but vehicle-focused expansion. Now, you'll notice on this that what I have at the top is Theed Royal Palace. Theed Royal Palace is a meta in of itself, okay? Everyone was running this. This battlefield was insanely good. And as printed, it was insanely good. It ended up later on getting a nerf, okay? And that you had to remove a die instead of just gain a resource. But this itself, I think, defined a meta or 2 or 3, maybe, right? So coming out of this, I believe this was a very strong meta where you had, this was a very, the decks that were good were really, really, really good in this meta, and the decks that were not, it was just a big gap. So that's what I'm trying to say, is we had a big gap. So Darth Vader and Greedo was probably the best Darth Vader deck, and this is Vader TTB, right? Came in ATG, big beat stick. You don't want to remove his stuff. He's huge, a lot of health, big dice, super scary. So there were 2 versions of him. There was the Greedo version, and then there was the red version using like the First Order Stormtrooper or something like that. You could also run him with Battle Droid and Retribution. I think that was probably the more popular red version, but overall the ability to use Greedo and then take advantage of some of the cards like Delve and stuff at the time that were still legal was very strong to be able to get crazy upgrades out. Okay. We also had Snoke Rebel Trader. So this is the deck that at the Portland Galactic something or other, I don't remember what we called him back then, but I am going 8-0 in Swiss with this deck. This deck was stupid good. Because at the time, right, you could just lay 1 into the Rebel Trader and swing 4 indirect, or whatever it may be, making money off of it, right? That was the main thing. If you look at the resource sites on Sienna, that's why we were primarily using her, just to make money, and then it was kind of a support, just good value type deck. Another deck that was very popular at the time, I'd put this in like the 1.5 range, was Iden Beckett. It was just kind of a very traditional, and that's probably why it wasn't good, is it was kind of a traditional Destiny deck of like put upgrades on your characters and roll them out and use them with a little bit of action cheating. And actually this deck had more than a little bit of action cheating. It had some good action cheating in there. Plus Beckett got a little bit of disruption. But again, the reason it was 1.5 is it was trying to play Destiny, and people weren't really playing Destiny. They were building boards and all that back then, which to them was Destiny, right? But what I'm talking about is traditional, like build your team, put upgrades on them, roll them out. So this deck struggled a little bit in competing. And then we had Beckett, Sienna, and I was actually Armored Reinforcement, right? But I put Fire Spray on here. This was known as the Fire Spray Reset deck. This is what ended up getting Sienna her nerf, because you could put out Fire Spray, you could play a mod on it for free, right? Or buy 2, but for free, effectively, like, your TLTs or whatever it may be, and then just roll in, and then do it again, and Beckett made money, and you had things like Truce, right? They could, like, Beckett could gain them running and then take your money. It's pretty gross, right? Pretty gross, because he could actually get right? The way it worked with the special is you could if they had 0, you could truce, gain a resource, and then special to take their money and then gain a resource. So anyway, that one ended up getting nerfed because it was pretty gross. Okay. All right. We then move into the next set, which was this was Convergence. Sorry. So Convergence dropped, and this is the set that changed everything. But it changed everything by using a lot of old characters. So we did get Jabba the Hutt. The deck that came out of this that lasted for several metas was Jaws. Jabba, Wat, Sentinel. This was basically a pure support deck. Again, it's rainbow, so you have access to everything. Look at how much health is on there. It's a lot of health. You have Sentinel Messenger, which let you look at the top card. Deck was crazy insane. I know Amy won at least 1 or 2 weeklies using this as well. And it was definitely across the top tables. I think Sean Cowan took this was during Spark of Hope, took it up to the meta we had, or the big tournament we had in Washington, and did quite well there as well. All right, Tarkin Snoke, again, this is the meta that actually earned Tarkin Snoke its ban, or Snoke got it his Rada finally between this and some of the other decks. So that one fell out, but this one picked up a lot of the trooper type stuff, a lot of 1-drops. It was, Conscript Squad that would roll in. Awesome there. Leia and Yoda became a real huge threat in this meta because they picked up some more good stuff for Yoda that he needed to help him out. And then even into the next meta, right, they picked up like the Resistance Ring that ended up getting itself a nerf. And then one of the big decks early was Han Biggs Falcon. And this was a disgusting action sheet deck. It really was. So the idea here was that you'd play AR as long as you could find 1 resource, which you could very easily do using Theed Palace. And this is again pre-Theed Palace nerf. But you could activate Biggs, which would let you activate Millennium Falcon, which would then let you activate Han Solo. So if you were to do that with an action cheat, which there was, I believe there were 2 action cheats available at the time. It was Instigate, right? So you could Instigate Biggs, Falcon, Han. You just rolled in, without upgrades, you rolled in 5 dice with pretty big, consistent guns. And you could just erase characters. And it was not that hard to keep doing it. All you needed to do was find 1 resource at some point, stick some upgrades on folks, have your Instigate ready to go. Right, so this was one where folks got pretty frustrated because in a game that was supposed to be back and forth, you could just eliminate characters. So you can see where that became a problem. But it was a super fun deck to play because when you rolled out and you just hit like 8 guns. But it's not fun to play if you're on the side of it. All right, I also have Vader X and Palpatine X. So Palpatine dropped in this set. Palpatine continued to be very strong all through the rest of the FFG metas. There were different partners for him that people had chosen over the years, but Watto was one that was very popular with him. There was also the red version, depending on which upgrade you wanted to play. And then Vader follows the same formula that we talked about before. Right, moving in though, and then to Spark of Hope, this set really did change a lot as well because we had the the no-die characters, right, is what happened in this set. So we had Snoke, Mandalorian, and Mud Trooper was a very big 3-wide out of this again, doing the Snoke stuff. Now at this point, or at least halfway through this, Snoke had received his nerf where he couldn't be used on any die, he could only be used on damage, so that's kind of why they switched over to more of a damage-focused type deck. Again, do 1 to a Mando and shoot for 4, do 1 to a Mud Trooper and shoot for 4. That's pretty good. We then had a very, very strong mill deck in Leia and Yoda. As I mentioned, they picked up, the ring and a couple other things for them. And then the big bad, zero question of it for probably the rest of Destiny until they specifically just scalped them, was droids. Okay, so droids R2, 3PO, and Chopper. 5 die, play off each other, huge synergy. Definitely, ended up winning worlds of the worlds of that meta. And I do want to say, though, this was a very good, aside from the fact that droids was just so dominant, this was actually a pretty fun meta overall, right? We had Raylo, which is a very fun deck. We had my deck, which was Mandalorian Maul, which I developed specifically as a counter to a lot of these wide decks. Worked very well. And then we had, of course, Ewoks. So Ewoks was made famous by Bobby Sapphire, I want to say very early on in the meta, where he was utilizing Hoth Trooper to be able to get some of the red cards that were the indirect cards, like Strength and Numbers and stuff like that. And he just, with one die on his team, was able to just generate value, and it was consistent value that you didn't need to roll for, right? So that was one of the, I think one of the ultimate black eyes on Destiny, was that they really took away rolling dice. But, you know, a lot of people like the play style as well. But certainly, again, if we're doing a review, we cannot leave out the Hoth Ewoks. Right, moving into SOH2. So again, CM was a long ways off and no news. So coming out of the summer, we wanted to shake things up, or FFG agreed they wanted to shake things up. So they actually went back and they made changes to they made significant changes to several characters, one of which being Zeb. So Zeb was dropped to 14 points ultimately, so he could pair actually with Mace Windu was something that came out of that. There was also a Zeb Jin deck that was out of that. Basically anybody who had big sides, because remember, Zeb could resolve as something else, so you could pair him with basically guns or melee, which is pretty awesome. Mike and I were repping the heck out of a deck we called Bad Droids at the time, which was using K2 and then R2 Chopper, right? And the reason we were doing that as a 4-die was because C-3PO had been nerfed maybe twice at that point, I think, in terms of how everything worked and in terms of his points. But this was a very fun, mod-heavy, redeploy-heavy. It was a very good deck. It was very fun, but it also felt fair. It didn't feel unfair like Droids did. So it was a very fun deck to be playing. And again, you didn't have people rolling their eyes at you when you sat down because you were playing Droids, okay? We also had DJ Talvin come out of this with Order 66 or Order 66. And this was just a pure removal deck. If this was definitely the table flip deck of the meta, right? It wasn't, usually it's like a mill deck, or it's the I'm so tired of droids rolling in, or it's the Han Biggs or whatever. This was definitely the deck that inspired the most ire of this particular meta, because they would just not do anything and remove your die and hit you, so you were punished for playing the game, right? Punishing people for playing the game always is relatively unpopular. But this deck was very strong because it had the Mother Talzin flipping, had the Mother Talzin fixing, I should say, to always present some baseline level of data. And then if they rolled in, you'd remove their stuff and say an aura, right? We also had R2. This was like a tier 1.5, maybe even slightly lower than that, but it was Kenobi R2 flipping in and going to that top side 3. It was pretty strong. Biden, Beckett also kind of made a resurgence. And what you're seeing here in this particular meta was because they made a couple specific targeted nerfs. I think this was also the implementation of the restricted list, where you had cards that couldn't, if they were on the list, you could only choose one of them. They couldn't play with others. So it really honed in kind of the top tier decks a lot and really dropped the power level overall. And that's why you see old decks like Jin Cassian came back up into play. It was never that those decks were bad. It's that by dropping the top down, you had a whole bunch of other decks who can now compete in this very wide meta, depending on the week to week of what people are showing up with. Right, moving in then to CM. Now, the disclaimer on this one is that this was pandemic era, right? So what happened here was that when CM dropped, we had maybe a couple of weeks before the world went into lockdown. So we didn't get a ton of in-person development on this set because everything that was high-level competitive was not happening for obvious reasons. So what this is more of a survey of what decks people were playing at the time from this set specifically. So we had Kragan Pyre. This was a very fun deck with lots of pings. We had Jango Boba. So that was SOH Jango and then CM Boba. And then they could pilot the Slave 1. Very cool deck there. Probably the big bad, not probably, almost certainly the big bad of the meta was dual Trandoshans with the IDT, the Imperial Death Trooper. So that single die Death Trooper and then two elite Trandoshans. Again, what we had seen in this set kind of the thing was the elite non-unique characters. And there were a lot of different pairings of that, but this one was definitely very strong because with bounties down, you could do fixing, and it was just a lot of damage. And again, you look at the amount of health there. Very, very strong deck. I was playing Tarful Ayla with the new tribe card, so that one was very cool. It was more of just a pet deck for me. Again, it was like a tier 1.5 type deck. It had a lot of good dice, a lot of good redeploys. And then my wife, Amy, was on Kanan, Hera, and Chopper at the time. Spectre, just a Spectre cell deck. And then there was a very cool piloting deck running around with Poe and Sabine that fit well together again. But these are primarily the decks out of that era. That's not to say that your Aphra decks, your Jaws decks weren't still also very strong. They were. I just wanted to give focus specifically on this set. And then very last, we had the biggest, I had spoken about the Black Eye of Destiny, but this Transformations was, the only reason Transformations wasn't a problem was because it was in lockdown and that we didn't have any major tournaments out of it. So a lot of insanely powerful cards came out of this. So specifically, we had Han Solo coming in with those die, right? Same die that we saw before with a really strong ability at 13 points. And you could also do the plot thing with him, but primarily just playing him at 13 points was really strong. We saw him pair with Poe. That was a really, that makes sense. We also had Anakin Skywalker, who, when you activated him, just deal a damage and deal 2 damage. So you were doing some after activation type stuff with him. We had Darth Vader, which became kind of a issue later on with some of the ARH stuff. And then probably there were 2 major problems out of Transformations. United We Stand was definitely a problem. On the surface, United We Stand, specifically United, is a good thing because it's rewarding mono decks in that case, right? But we had some problems come out of that in terms of essentially trapping people into playing the game or punishing them for playing the game. And then almost certainly the big early problem, which was fixed, was 5s, right? So 5s had no die, but after you activate him, you roll a clone trooper into the pool. So what that means is that he as a character doesn't specifically have any dice associated with him. He's just rolling in other dice. So you could do tricks like feint or roll the pass, right? Or through the pass, right? So feint says activate one of your characters, then remove all of its character and upgrade dice to ready of it. Well, he doesn't have any. So you could do that, roll in 1 or 2 clone troopers, and then do it again. And through the pass was very similar, right? Activate one of your character's ports, and you can spend resources equal to the number of dice you just rolled. Well, that was 0, right? Because it wasn't him rolling, it was them rolling in. So you could basically do multi-activation 5s and just kind of spam the board with clone trooper dice and then do stuff on that. So again, I don't want to sound too down on Transformations because it came at a time that it wasn't really relevant to everything going on because we were all in lockdown, we were doing our thing on TTS, but it definitely had its ripple effects going forward as well. So, all right, I don't know how long I've been talking for, probably a long time, but that is the full recap of what I identified as the defining decks from each FFG meta. Now, I want to be very clear, folks. I'm certain there are decks that I missed that were your pet decks. There are other decks I was playing that are not on there. And no offense is meant, and you can always put in the comments below what decks you want to talk about, right? Because again, it's back in the member berries machine, and it's a lot of stuff to put into context. So anyway, if you're still here with me at this point, which I doubt most of you are, go ahead and give me a comment that says still here or something like that. I really appreciate it. And thanks for joining. Nothing else, folks. Go Commando.